Good evening, everyone. 1 week from tonight, the voters in Arizona will choose their party nominees for the office of governor of this great state of Arizona. This decision is critically important to all of us, and particularly to local elected officials from Arizona's 91 incorporated cities and towns who are partners in governing with their state. In tonight's final major gubernatorial event before the election day, we are pleased to partner with Channel 8's Arizona Horizon program and the host of the program, Ted Simons, who will serve as our moderator. Ted.
Thank you very much. Thank you, appreciate that. Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon to everyone on stage and to everyone in the audience, and welcome to our live web stream viewers, thus the cameras, thus the lights. Now, the League invited all gubernatorial candidates who filed for the ballot under the Republican and Democratic parties. They are all with us tonight, with the exception of Doug Ducey, who declined to attend, and Fred Duvall, who apparently, at this point, is unable to attend. We will welcome Mr. Duvall if and when he does arrive. Each of the candidates will begin with a 2-minute opening statement. Each candidate will then be asked 2 questions relating specifically to city and town issues in Arizona, followed by a series of questions and follow-ups on other issues of statewide importance. And then, when we're all done fussing and fighting up here, we'll have 1-minute closing remarks from each candidate. Okay, let's get started now with the 2-minute opening remarks. And again, in alphabetical order, we will start with Ken Bennett.
We always start with the B's for some reason. Good evening, I'm Ken Bennett, and I'm currently serving, as you know, as the Secretary of State. I'm a 5th-generation Arizonan. Great-grandparents in the Douglas area, great-grandparents in Gilbert on one side of the family, and then on the other side of the family, great-grandfather, first mayor of Glendale. The next generation made its way to Prescott, where my mom was born and where I grew up. Grandma and Grandpa's phone number in Prescott was 49. So that tells you how long we've been in the Prescott area. And if you remember one thing about Ken Bennett, it's these 2 words: experience matters. Now, it's not just government experience. I have worked in private business for about 30 years. For 24 of those years, I ran our family fuel distribution company in the Prescott area. Grandma and Grandpa started with a gasoline station there in Prescott, and pretty soon they had 2 or 3, and one of the companies made them the distributor. My parents bought the business, and then I ran it from the mid-'80s until about 2006 or 7. For the last 6 years, I've been living in the Phoenix area because there's a actually thing in the Constitution that says the statewide elected officials have to live in Maricopa County. I've always considered myself a rural Arizonan, but for the last 6 years I've been here and serving on the board of directors for the Cancer Treatment Center of America Hospital out in Goodyear. During 25 of those 30 years, I've also served in public service. As many of you know, I started on the Prescott City Council. I think that's very important for our elected state leaders to understand how local government works. And that was a good foundation for me to see how government works at the local level, closest to the people. And that was a good foundation that when I became later a state legislator, I always remembered that foundation and made sure during my 8 years as a state senator, 4 of which I was president of the Senate, that the state did not balance its budget on the backs of our local cities and towns. And as your governor, I will commit to make sure that we don't do that and that everything we do at the state level will support you at the local level. Thank you for being here this evening.
All right, thank you, Ken. Our next opening statement now, Christine Jones.
Thank you so much, Ted, and thank you all for being here. I'm Christine Jones. I am a Republican candidate for governor, but I haven't always been a candidate for governor. Not so long ago, I was a regular, ordinary, everyday, average citizen sitting in seats listening to other people running for governor. And in the last year, I have traveled about 40,000 miles all over the state to all 15 counties. And to those of you who I see and recognize here tonight, I want to say thank you very much for your hospitality, your kindness, for giving me such an incredible knowledge about the incredible people in Arizona. Lots of mayors, lots of city council members, and I thank you for that. And to the League of Cities and Towns, for the incredible education you've given me, I thank you. Now, I'm running for governor because as a person who had the great good fortune to join a tiny little startup technology company with just a few dozen employees and grow it to about 4,000 people, I understand the need for us to have a governor who focuses on economic development from a results-oriented private sector approach. And as a person who grew up in humble beginnings, like most people in Arizona, and worked my way through college to become a CPA and a lawyer, I understand the need for every child in Arizona to have exactly the opportunity I did, which is an excellent childhood education. And then as a person who's now traveled around and talked to lots of people around the state and confirmed what I suspected all along, that border security is a critical issue for everybody in the state because it touches so many areas, the economy, education, homeland security, citizenship. I understand that together we need to acknowledge these issues for what they are and get that border secure. I look very much forward to your questions tonight. I thank you for hosting this. It's my honor to be here, and in the end, I'm going to ask for your support. I hope I'll earn it. Thanks.
Christine, thank you very much. Frank Riggs now with his 2-minute opening remarks.
Good afternoon, Ted, and ladies and gentlemen. It is a delight to be with you. And first of all, thank you all very much for your service to your communities and to our state. I'm Frank Riggs, Republican candidate for governor, a resident of Scottsdale, here this evening with my wife, Kathy, of 34 years, native daughter, born in Tucson. We are the parents of 3 beautiful adult children, all grown and married, and now 3 grandchildren. A month ago this Thursday, we welcomed into the world and into Arizona our most recent grandchild, and like her paternal grandmother, Kathy, she too is a native daughter of Arizona. That's why I care so deeply about the challenges that our state faces, and why I think that I bring to this race the deepest leadership experience, the most proven record, and the highest ethics and integrity to serve in the highest elective office in our state. I'm a proud Army veteran, the only military veteran running for governor. I'm a former police officer and deputy sheriff, and that's actually how Kathy and I met. She's a former police officer, a trailblazer, and a pioneer. I'm a successful small business owner. I'm a former school board president, and I'm a former 3-term United States congressman. Serving in Congress at a time when we balanced the federal budget, we fundamentally reformed welfare by imposing time limits and work requirements on welfare recipients, and frankly, we made bipartisan and divided government work because Bill Clinton was in the White House. I'm going to be the public safety, states' rights, and education governor. And when I say states' rights, by the way, I don't mean just standing up for Arizona's sovereignty. I mean protecting local government as well. And what I'd like to discuss with you this evening is some pretty grim news that was shared with me a week ago when State Senate President Andy Biggs and his budget analyst briefed me on the state budget forecast and gave me a projection of a $923 million budget deficit starting next July at the beginning of FY15. We've got to resolve that challenge together.
All right. Thank you, Frank. Scott Smith now with his opening remarks.
Thank you, Ted, and my gosh, thank you so very much for welcoming us back. I really feel like I'm home, and it's a great feeling to see so many familiar faces, friendly faces out in the audience there today. The 6 years I was honored to serve as mayor of Mesa was not only an honor because I was able to serve my constituents, but because I served with the finest fellow public servants that I'd ever known, and that's those in our cities and towns from around this state. And earlier today, I was more than honored, and I actually got a little choked up to have a couple dozen mayors stand behind me from all over this state to talk about how we work together to make things happen. And that's what I think my candidacy is all about. I am also a native Arizonan, 4th generation. My parents grew up in eastern Arizona at the Safford and Thatcher area, Gila Valley. I'm from Tucson. My father was in education and was superintendent of schools down in the Floyd Wells district, and then came to Mesa, and that's where I've lived since then. After 30 years in business, I, like many of you, decided to get involved in public service. Why we did it, we'll never know. But over the next few years, I learned why. Because the rewards that I received, and I know you received on a daily basis, were just overwhelming. The ability to do things, to make things happen. That's where things, and it's the cities and towns where things happen now. It used to be said the states were the laboratory of democracy. Well, I can tell you that after serving here in Arizona and also being honored to be the president of the United States Conference of Mayors for a year, I can tell you that the real action happens in the cities and towns of America. And that's because that's where people don't get hung up by partisan battles. They talk about real solutions. They talk about real opportunities. They talk about real things that we can do. That's what I've pledged to do as your governor. I pledge to not only work with you, but to be hand in hand with those people who are on the street every day, meeting with their constituents and knowing exactly what happens in real life, not in a political wonderland. I'm privileged and honored to be here with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. And now opening remarks from Andrew Thomas.
Thank you very much, Ted. Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight and for hosting this important forum a week before the election. And thank you for your service to your communities, including my own here in Phoenix. I'm going to be direct and to the point, as I have been throughout this campaign and indeed perhaps to a fault throughout my public career. If we do not secure our border, if we do not stop illegal immigration, if we do not address this issue that trumps all others for us in the state of Arizona, we face a very grim future. That is true for all Arizonans, no matter where you live. And we must be honest about this fact and direct, and we must get a leader in the governor's office who will be equally direct and forthright and forceful in dealing with this issue. If we do not secure our border, very soon, it will be too late, and we will be on the road to a Detroit-style bankruptcy, as other states are that have not handled this problem effectively. It is a very difficult fight. It requires unique toughness, frankly, in the public officials, the very few who have dared to tackle it. But I have shown that. When I ran the first time successfully for Maricopa County Attorney, I had a slogan on my signs that said, "Stop illegal immigration." And elites were skeptical, said it couldn't be done, but we did succeed. We stopped illegal immigration for a period of time because I reached out to allies in the legislature and elsewhere, and we got the job done. But since I left office 4 years ago, things have unraveled. We are no longer stopping illegal immigration. In fact, illegal immigrants now stay here and they protest, knowing that nothing will be done to them. I will change that, and we will face a much brighter future if we secure our border fiscally, economically, socially, politically. That is what I offer. There are other important issues. I look forward to discussing them, but that is the one that looms above all others, and I alone will address it successfully. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Each candidate will now have 2 minutes to respond to each of these 2 questions, and then we'll open it up to more varied questions. But these you all get, and we're going to come to the opposite direction. Andrew, we'll start with you. The shared revenue system in Arizona provides cities and towns with a portion of the state income tax, state sales tax, vehicle license tax, and highway user revenue fund, better known as HERF. Revenue sharing generally makes up the second largest source of revenue for cities and towns throughout the state. Now, as governor, will you uphold the existing municipal revenue sharing system and end sweeps of funds such as HERF?
I support the current system, and I oppose those sweeps. And I'll be direct about this. Maintaining and, in fact, enhancing our state highway system is an important cause to me, and at the root of that is economic development that affects the entire state, but particularly rural areas. And candidly, the reason why this has become a focus of mine throughout this campaign is because I did not grow up in rural Arizona, but I grew up in a rural area of another state, in southern Missouri. And they have a very extensive highway system there that connects all the small communities. And it is effective, and it is important for economic growth in those areas. And I've lived in Arizona for 23 years, but as I have driven throughout this state, I have realized in many areas of the state we lack that. It is often very difficult to go from one small community to another. You have to go well out of your way, and not just because of mountains, but just because we don't have the highway infrastructure. We need to invest in our highways because that is something that conservatives can agree government can legitimately do. Government can help build roads and highways and provide a means to finance that properly. I believe the HERF fund exists for that reason. It should be defended, and I, as governor, would do that.
All right, thank you very much. Scott, again, same question.
A topic which is near and dear to my heart, and I have the scars on the back to show about that. As a mayor sitting here, we're in the worst recession ever. The temptation of the legislature to always take that which is not theirs and to then brag about how they've balanced the budget was something we fought as a group for the last 6 years that I was in office. And I think there's a little bit of education that needs to be done. Not only will I support the system, but I will absolutely educate the legislators and those in the state as to what really shared revenue is. Because it disappointed me to sit down with the legislature and have them, first of all, say, well, we give you your portion. No. They don't realize the grand bargain that was made decades ago where cities agreed to stay out of certain revenue streams for the idea that we would divide these revenues. We would share these revenues. In fact, if you look at the state budget, shared revenue is, and if I'm as a CPA, I look at above the line, below the line, it's not the starting point. The starting point for the state budget is after the division is made. This is not the state's money to give to the cities. This is money which we share. So not only will I support the system, but any discussion, anything that talks about the state ever touching those is off the table before the discussion begins. I believe that as a mayor. I will do that as a governor. When it comes to HERF, there's a reality. And the reality is that the state has no business using those monies for things for which it was specifically pledged, not this gray area where they might wiggle a little bit. But that is also the start of this discussion. But here's a second part of that reality. Our state is now cooked on fund sweeps. Our budget cannot be balanced right now without fund sweeps, and we have got to find a way to work together to end that. As someone who understands both sides of that equation, it will be my number one issue to say no, no, and hell no. It's not going to happen.
All right, Frank, what do you think about sweeps?
Well, I think first of all, I think it's telling that Mr. Ducey, the state treasurer, isn't here because in the course of this campaign, he has recklessly called, in my opinion, for the complete elimination of state income taxes. That's an irresponsible statement to be saying when you're pursuing the highest elective office in our state at this point in our state's history, number one. Number two, the reality of HERF, by the way, the reality, Scott, is that HERF funds have been diverted, they've been swept to pay for public safety, for DPS. It's a Hobson's choice because public safety is the highest priority and responsibility of state government. I represented a congressional district that was largely rural in nature, 450 miles long, and I served on the House Public Works and Transportation Committee during my 3 terms in the United States Congress. I understand how important both federal and state funding is for infrastructure needs, especially in rural Arizona, and the impact that has on rural economies. The lion's share, of course, of the funding for transportation projects is the federal funding. It comes from the Federal Highway Trust Fund. That's federal gas tax monies that you pay into the fund every time you gas up at the pumps. But we need the HERF funds to be used for that dedicated purpose because you're also paying a state gas tax when you gas up at the pumps. And of course, the state share out of HERF are the matching funds that qualify us for the federal funding. So I want to stop the sweeps, but I want to work with local government to figure out, and the state legislature, of course, of how we're going to do this without gutting state government, without a devastating impact on local government, and especially, again, the economies of rural Arizona. You know, you can't campaign the width and breadth of this state, all 15 counties, and not witness a pretty terrible reality, and that is rural Arizona is dying on the vine. There are, frankly, too many boarded up communities, and we need to revive our economy in rural Arizona, and the key to doing that is protecting both federal and state funding for our critical infrastructure needs to ensure the flow of goods and commerce.
Frank, thank you. Christine, shared revenue system and the sweep of funds.
Yeah, by far the biggest pain point that any of the mayors or city council or county supervisors have shared with me as I've traveled around is this single issue. And having now driven almost 45,000 miles on some of those roads, I can tell you, I saw the mayor of Kingman earlier, my kidney is somewhere around I-40 going in over the hill into Bullhead City. This is a serious issue for us. And part of the problem is nobody would run a business like this, right? Nobody would centralize all the spending, all the decision-making, all of that power at the state level because the people who know the constituents who walk up and down the street every day and look them in the eye tend to know better how to spend money and how to make decisions and how to allocate resources. The problem is we don't have enough money to meet our revenues or to meet our obligations as a state. So what we have to do, and even conservatives have fallen prey to the notion that the only way to raise revenue is to raise taxes. It's not. It's not. That's not how you raise revenue. But as a government, you have to talk about that because we barely have enough money to meet our obligations as it is. You know the state is sweeping these funds for a reason, right? I hear people talk about $800 million in HERF over the last 6 years. It's actually a lot more than that. If you look at all of the other designated funds, it's closer to $2.1 billion. How are we going to pay that money back? We got to make more money. If you're in the private sector, you would say, we got to sell more stuff. How do you do that? You got to set the playing field for private business to create jobs. That's the way to do this. Jobs lead to taxpayers. Taxpayers leads to more revenue. More revenue leads to lower taxes. But we got to get this money back out there, not just so that you can fix your streets, not just so that you can collect the trash, but because what we're setting up here is the most impossible situation where you've collected a fee, you've already taxed your citizens, and now we're asking you to go out and bond for it or take on debt for it and tax them a second time, and you still don't have enough money to fix the street. This is an impossible thing, and one reason I would argue that once in a while you got to have a business person in charge to bring this thing back to a discussion about balancing the budget, looking at the set of metrics against which your performance is measured, and looking at both sides of the income statement.
All right, thank you very much. Ken?
Well, I can answer this absolutely yes, but not just in a theoretical sense going forward as to what I will do if elected as governor, but based on the experience that I proved when I was in the state Senate for 8 years and 4 years as the Senate president. When I got there, something had just happened. I was a lowly freshman, and I knew that the percentage was supposed to be 15%, and I went to a budget hearing, and somebody said, you know, because of this or that or whatever, we've negotiated a temporary agreement with the cities and towns that we're going to share at 14.8, and that's going to help the state budget. And I asked a little question. I said, well, when the economy reverses, are we going to go back to them and then share it at 15.2? Well, that thought had never occurred to them somehow. So when I became president of the Senate, we eliminated the sweep of HERF, and I will do so as governor. And it won't be a phased out thing. It will be from day one, because we made a commitment between each other to share these revenues, and we will go back to that agreement from day one if I'm elected governor. And it's not, as I said, just a theoretical thing of what I hope and promise to do going forward. I proved it during the years that I was in the Senate. We not only restored the full share of those revenues, but it was during those 4 years when we were Senate president that we also established a fund of over $345 million, I think it was, to accelerate transportation projects throughout the state. So we were not only keeping our word on sharing the revenues. You know, I was raised by my family, our church, and the Boy Scouts. And every Wednesday night I went to scout meeting, would hold up my arm and say the scout law. A scout is trustworthy, loyal, and there's 10 others, all the Eagle Scouts, and helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. But when you give your word that we're going to share those revenues above the line, as Scott mentioned, you keep your word. And that's what we did when I was Senate president. That's what we'll do if I'm elected governor.
Thank you very much. Our second prepared question, and we'll go in the opposite order, so Ken, get ready now. You're back at the top there. Each city and town in the state is unique, with differing levels of service, differing community standards and expectations, and different geographic and financial circumstances. As much as practicable, cities and towns enact local ordinances that reflect their unique character and their diverse population. Question: do you support the principle of local control and oppose state preemptions of local authority?
Absolutely, yes. I can remember as a new city councilman in Prescott, I was barely 25 years old, so we had a training session. It was a unique circumstance in which 5 of the 9 positions on the Prescott Council had turned over during that election. So we had a lot of training to do, especially me as a young 25-year-old. And I can remember Jack Dabalski from the League of Cities coming up and having a training session with us. And he shared with us the Dabalski theory of government, which was that every level of government is always complaining about the ones above them, giving them unfunded mandates and telling them what to do. And yet, for some reason, after they complain about that, they turn right around and do the same things to the levels of government below them. And I promised then, not knowing though that I was planning on ever being in the legislature, that if I ever had an opportunity to break that theory or not be a person that participated in that theory, that I would do so. When I got to the legislature, I made sure that in everything that we did, at least the votes that I cast and the things that I had control over, which were quite a few during the 4 years as Senate President, that we did not usurp control from the local communities. For example, I would not have supported or signed the election consolidation bill that was done a couple of years ago. I'm not convinced that that's not going to have unintended consequences of ballot drop-off as people get down to the very low part of very long ballots. So absolutely, I will resist whenever possible, and I think that's always in usurping the control of the local communities.
Local control versus state preemption of local control.
Yeah, I think this is a critical issue. I mentioned it briefly in the prior answer, and since I failed to answer the question about shared revenues, let me just say that that goes along with the spending distribution out to the local areas. I think the last governor to make this commitment was Fife-Symington, to actually say we'll stick at the level and we won't go below it. I do think that that's a commitment that you should make to the local cities and towns, because it's important for you to have a landscape that you can predict. Regardless of what the level is, you ought to know what it is. Getting to the local control piece, this is really critical, and it's in so many areas. It's not just in preemption per se, but could you imagine a system where we established state standards for education and applied them at a local level without regard to the state getting in your way? You might actually be able to educate kids as if they were individual human beings instead of commodities or some kind of fungible assets. This is something that's critical, both to me as a business person, but also to me as a citizen, because I think if you read the Constitution, you'll find there are only certain enumerated powers that are reserved to the federal government. Everything else is reserved to the state. And it is to the state to give to the local governments control over the things which the local governments are good at. This includes what we talked about before with roads and education and so many things. Part of the issue that we have here is when Governor Brewer took over, the state was in a really critical financial crisis. And I think it's important for us not to be overly critical, particularly for somebody like me who wasn't part of the conversation, to lob hand grenades into the stadium when we didn't have to make these critical decisions. But now we're building on what has come before, and to say, what can we do? What can we build on given where we are today? And I really think if we look at both sides of the income statement and say, what is the revenue generating piece that will help us meet those unfunded mandates and the critical budget shortage that we have coming, part of it is getting those decisions back out to you.
All right, thank you very much. Frank, what do you think about this?
Not just yes, but heck yes. In fact, Ted told me I couldn't stand up, but if I could, I'd stand up right here and now, raise my right hand, and make a pact with you. It's pretty easy for me because it's consistent with my philosophy about government. I really think government governs best, that governs close, governs least, but also governs closest to the people, the taxpayer, the constituent. I also believe in Abraham Lincoln's philosophy, government should never do for man what man can do for himself. But I absolutely believe in local control and decision-making. You can't be a fiscally conservative Republican and not subscribe to that. That's one reason, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so opposed to Common Core, and why I've said I'll use the executive authority of the governor's office to repeal Arizona's participation in Common Core on day one in order to restore local control and decision-making in K-12 education, which is a fundamental responsibility of state and local government and consumes 40% of state taxpayer dollars. When I served in Congress, I was one of the co-authors, co-sponsors of the Unfunded Mandates Act. Very simply said that federal government cannot impose unfunded or, and you all will all understand this, underfunded mandates on state government. But I also believe the same should hold true for state government, because I call it the money mirage. You know, ultimately the money goes away, but the mandate stays in place. So I really want to protect local control and decision-making. And frankly, I will regard you, the elected officials, duly elected representatives of the people, closest to the people, as my colleagues and my partners.
Thank you very much. Scott.
There's been an ongoing philosophical battle, which really should have ended about a year or two ago, and that is, you know, where do cities fit within this? Are they subdivisions of the state, subject to the whim of the state, or are they somewhat autonomous? And the reality is that, yeah, technically we are subdivisions of the state, but there is one fact that people forget. The state of Arizona has never incorporated a single city or town. Think about that. People come together to form cities and towns under the powers given and granted by the state constitution. And they do that for a reason. They do that so they can plot their own path, so they can make their own decisions, so they can make sure that cities like Mesa are different from Tempe and Glendale and Page, and that's okay. That's wonderful. And as governor, I will not only continue that fight to make sure that cities and towns can, and the citizens therein, can decide what they want to do, I'll take it one step further. When I'm elected governor and I take office, I will issue an executive order that states that no executive department will administer a law that creates an unfunded mandate on a city or a town, and that they will look at everything that is passed by the legislature. I will not sign a bill that creates an unfunded mandate or takes control away from a city or a town, because that's the beauty of our state. The state Supreme Court a year or so ago in the Tucson decision went to the extreme case of stating the history of Arizona. I think it was Justice Bales who talked about the history of this relationship between cities and towns and the state, and sided with our philosophy, which was people come together to chart their own destiny. They form cities and towns so they can decide what they want. And if people don't like that, they have the ability to move to a place where they feel comfortable. That should not only be a philosophical reason to give local control, that's a political reason, and that should be played out in the policy that is undertaken and is given from the very top down through the legislature to the local city and town. And I will adhere to that, I will promote that, and I promise to you that I will live by that.
Thank you, Scott. Andrew.
Local control and autonomy are very important principles throughout American government, throughout our history, actually. And I wrote a book on crime once upon a time, and one of the things I found interesting in researching the book is that America has a lot more police departments than other industrialized nations do, and it's because people in their various communities like to have police who are directly accountable to them, and that's the case in Arizona. School boards, another great example, and I share the strong opposition to Common Core, by the way, which I think is a very misguided federal policy and an attempted federal takeover of our local school systems. And so I stand foursquare behind the proposition that we need to have local control and autonomy. Occasionally, there are exceptions to that rule that I think are important, and a couple of them and the principle I think that should guide them is when an important constitutional right is at stake or some overriding issue of great importance to the state is at stake, then the state can legitimately trump that economy. I'll give you a couple examples. Number one, I believe in the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms, and I don't think that it's appropriate for local communities to be infringing upon that right. And so when the state has acted to safeguard that right, I think that's been appropriate. The second area is in the enforcement of our immigration laws. We should not have cities and towns that are refusing to enforce duly enacted laws to deal with crackdowns on illegal immigration. That has been a problem in the past. And so those are a couple of examples of areas where I do differ, do depart from that general principle of upholding local autonomy and control.
Thank you, Andrew, and we welcome Fred Duvall to the panel.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Okay.
And I appreciate your allowing me to enter the party a bit late, although I guess an hour and a half earlier than Doug. So.
Question. We've already answered one question. We came in on this particular question, so I'll reiterate it very quickly there.
Terrific.
Are you all set?
I think I've got the gist
You got 2
of it.
minutes now.
All right.
All right. Do you support the principle of local control and oppose state preemption of local authority?
Yes. And while we may find areas of disagreement in today's conversation, this probably isn't going to be one of them. I do believe in the principle of local control, believe that cities and city elected leaders are in a position to guide the unique characteristics, needs of their communities and wishes of their citizens. I've demonstrated my history in this area. Actually, it goes all the way back. I used to work for Governor Babbitt back in the 70s and 80s, and many of you remember Jack Dabalski. And Jack Dabalski, Ken will remember, he smiled, one of the great effective representatives of the League of Cities and Towns ever. And we created the formula in 1979 that would assure shared state revenue with cities and counties. And the reason for that is because there was a constant mishmash of new initiatives and fees and tax increases, and it became terribly important for cities and counties to have stable assurances about revenue, for bond ratings to be sure, for long-term strategic plans to be sure. And so the constant reduction of those revenues is, I think, wrong. HERF sweeps, which has left about $200 million in unmet needs, is wrong for our citizens and wrong given the principle of state-local relationships. And, and it's just, it's too often hypocritical of those of us at the state level to attack the federal government for its mandates and then apply them to local government. And I don't see this. I think a prominent legislator once referred to this as a parent relationship. It's not a parent relationship, it's a partnership. And a partnership collaborate, a partnership respects one another, and I greatly respect the role that you play in our lives in Arizona.
Okay, let's go ahead and open up here now for some general questions. We can actually follow up on some of the things you've mentioned before. Ken, everyone seems to be opposed to the idea of sweeps, and they don't like the idea, and yet legislative body, governor, you ask them, they'll say, had to be done. State had to do this. Financial situation called for it. No second thoughts on it. How do you respond to something like that?
I respectfully disagree. During my 4 years as Senate President, we had, there were a couple of good economic years in 05 and 06 and into 7. But we had some tough economic years in 3 and 4. And even when we became Senate President, we were dealing with a budget shortfall left over from the previous governor. But whether it's in good years or bad, but especially in bad years, when the state thinks that things are tough for us, they're tough for all of you as well. And we cannot shift the burden of thinking that, well, we just can't do it without some of your money. That's crazy. We can't do it generationally. We've got to live within our means. And shifting the burden from one generation to another is unacceptable, but shifting the burden from the state to the local communities is unacceptable. And I simply rejected the idea that we couldn't balance a state budget unless we took some of the city's money. We can balance and will balance the state's money, a budget with our own money, not yours, if I'm the governor.
Christine, again, I think many would agree, should not, would rather not. Many lawmakers would say, had no choice but to do that. You agree with that? Was there no choice? Were there other options?
Well, this is what I say. We have to be careful about lobbing hand grenades into the stadium, and we weren't part of the conversation. I mean, this was a critical financial situation, and so would I have sold off state buildings and leased them back? As a CPA, no, I thought that was a bad economic decision. Nevertheless, I don't think it's helpful for us to sit here and criticize when we didn't have an opportunity to offer those solutions. So I think we have to guard against that in our discourse, because we've gotten away from civil discussion. There used to be a time in our society when you could actually say something nice, even about the people with whom you disagreed. And it was a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. I think we have to have leadership that's willing to do that in this state and in this country, because I don't think sweeping your funds was the right thing to do. Nevertheless, it happened, and we are where we are, and we need to move forward with it. What are we going to do going forward if we are to stop sweeping? We have to have other ways to increase revenue, because we don't meet our obligations as a state as it is. There is no such thing as shrinking a government, friends. Despite the fact that our colleague on this panel is missing, I will use his line and tell you it can't happen. We can't eliminate the income tax unless we tell you how we're going to raise taxes. These are critical issues for serious people to tell you the truth about. And I'm not a politician as a career, so I'm just going to speak the truth to you, and that's where I stand on that.
Frank, again, we're not asking for civil discourse. We're not talking for lobbing stones and grenades and things, but you can answer whether or not you thought lawmakers did the right thing.
Well, I don't want a Monday morning quarterback, Ted, honestly. I mean, I understand why the governor and the legislature did it, because they didn't want to raise taxes in the midst of the most severe recession in our lifetimes. I'm very worried we're headed down that path again, though, because in this forecast that I alluded to in my opening remarks, one of the reasons that we're now facing a $924 million projected budget deficit for next year is because in this past year, the budgeted growth rate was 4.3%, actual revenue growth was 2.8%. That 1.5% delta is contributing to that huge deficit. But what I think the legislature, where they may have missed the ball, is I think they could have gone a step further. I think they could have done fundamental budget and tax reform and put our state government on much sounder, long-term, solvent footing. And I just want to mention one idea, because I probably could get consensus here on this, and that is we need to separate our operating budget from our capital budget. Our state infrastructure needs need to be in a separate capital budget, because those are infrastructure projects that frankly are going to be used by and should be paid for generations of taxpayers. We also need to amend the aggregate debt limit in our state constitution, 102 years old, that limits the aggregate debt of Arizona state government to $350,000. That's absurd. That was real money 102 years ago, but it's an absurdly low figure now for a state and economy our size, and it prevents us, frankly, from using the full faith and credit of Arizona state government to borrow in the capital and bond markets for those long-term infrastructure projects.
Scott, again, let's balance here. Revenue enhancement or doing what you got to do, shell games, robbing Peter to pay Paul, you use a cliche, something that the legislature said they had difficult times, called for difficult measures?
Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And as cities, we know we can't play shell games. We have to, at the end of the day, make sure our revenues and our expenditures match. It doesn't do any good to look back other than to learn from history what we will need to do in the future. And the fact is that Frank's right. We have $1 billion now. And this $1 billion is not because of some revenue. This is a structural deficit that the state of Arizona will face as early as fiscal 2016. That's outside any kind of mismatches on the revenue growth and the economic growth and things like that. So that means we are staring down. Here's what we don't have that we can learn from the last time. The last time when we had a huge deficit, the state did basically three things. They did increase tax. Well, the people increased tax through Prop 100, temporary sales tax. They did borrow. They sold our state buildings, and we don't have any more state buildings to sell. The third thing is they took hundreds of million dollars, not billions of dollars of money from Barack Obama, from the federal government, and stimulus monies. We got to look at this $1 billion that's coming up, and I seriously doubt that certainly at least two of those threes are not going to be there. Selling state buildings, we've run out of it. There's no stimulus money, and who knows what will happen in the other one. But we've got $1 billion, and yet we've got these real problems. We already have these fund scoops we've talked about. We have a huge issue that we need to have an honest discussion with the citizens of Arizona about what kind of government they're going to have. Because actually, I think the legislature did do what they had to do to balance the budget. We're not going to have those tools going forward. So what can we do? We're going to have to get creative. I agree with Frank. I think most of you would be shocked to know that the state does not separate capital like we do in the city level. They do not have the tools and have not had the tools of bonds, general revenue bonds and revenue bonds and obligation bonds to build things that will benefit for years and actually that more than pay for themselves. I think we have to get very creative, look at our taxing system, look at what kind of government we truly want, because I will tell you, we will, unless there's some kind of miraculous economic recovery that puts us in the mode of having significant revenue growth, we will be in a structural situation, and we will be revisiting this as soon as 2 years from now. That calls for creativity. That calls for innovation. Cities are used to that. They're good at that.
Andrew, I'm going to get a Monday morning quarterback if it kills me here. What do you think about what the legislature did? And again, the idea that they had to do it, because that's what we heard on the program. That's what lawmakers told me. You buying it?
Well, I know you're gunning for somebody to endorse shell games, Ted. I know that's what you're gunning for. I'm not going to endorse shell games. I'm sorry. And I think, look, tough job, and I don't presume to second guess everything that the legislature does or has done. But when you have funds that are earmarked for a specific purpose by law, by definition, you should be very deferential at a minimum to that sentiment and making sure that those funds flow to their intended purpose. But here's the thing. We obviously have tremendous fiscal pressures facing us in the future. And we've got to think big picture about how to deal with those fiscal pressures. And it's going to take getting a lot of bright, committed minds together to figure out how to get out of this hole that we're in. And I don't think you can blame any one person for it. But there are a couple things we need to keep in mind. First of all is economic growth. We can help to grow our way out of this mess, this fiscal mess that we're in, by growing the state economy. And there are ways that a governor and strong leaders can help to do that with common sense tax and regulatory policies, a vision for growth, creative new ideas to bring jobs and economic investment here, making sure our system of higher education produces college graduates who can actually get full-time jobs, which nationally most college graduates cannot get a full-time job in their area of study. That's a terrible failure on our part. We need to start being honest about that. And we also cannot forget the elephant in the room, which is our problem with the border. If we are one of 4 border states, and if we do not deal with that problem, we're just whistling Dixie and pretending that we can solve all these fiscal problems when almost $3 billion a year is being earmarked not for these funds, but for dealing with the consequences of illegal immigration in this state.
Fred, tough times in the past, response was A. Tough times in the future, response B?
How about C? Look, we are not out of the recession. We are still in tough times. But I do believe in the maxim, to govern is to choose. And the legislature met and made a set of choices. And In those choices, they treated Heritage Fund, local transportation funds, HERF, as essentially a piggy bank to balance the state budget. And I think it's the wrong choice. But to govern is to choose. When they come in and say they don't have any choices, it's because what they're saying is they've made other choices that preclude maintaining the partnership and the commitment to cities and counties, and I think that's wrong. The second reason why I'm concerned that it's wrong is not just philosophical, but it's in the interaction between the state and the cities. And I would note that the HERF sweeps began before the recession, so let's put that in context. It changes the relationship to one where the state begins to barter with cities, where there's almost a hostage relationship, where there's where these funds become trade bait against other issues. It's an unhealthy relationship. It's one that's based on mistrust rather than trust. It's not one based upon partnership. I'd like to go in the other direction. How can we enhance your toolbox? Should we look at a state infrastructure bank? Should we look at TIF financing? What are the additional tools to be more creative that the state can help you by pursuing? And secondly is how do we assure that beyond the budget, the state shows some discipline in its tendency to prohibit you from the things that you need to do to make local decisions and to make your cities thrive. So I think there's a philosophical view of this as well as a budget view of this that requires us to recognize that governing is choosing and we've made the wrong choices.
Let's start down here. Andrew, when it comes to economic development, give Arizona a grade with the recognition that job creation in Arizona still lags the national numbers, average numbers here. What's going on? Why aren't those numbers better? And give us a grade as far as economic development right now in Arizona.
Well, I'll be generous and give it a C, I guess. I mean, the reality is we're not growing, and there are various reasons for that, and I'm not going to limb all of them here tonight. But the bottom line is, as I mentioned before, we need to have tax and regulatory policy for our state that compares favorably to those of other states, because we are competing with those other states for the jobs and investment that's necessary for our economic growth. That's just the reality. There are 50 states to choose from, and this is increasingly an international economy. And here I'm not focusing so much on California because they have their problems, but they also have their unique advantages, let's be honest. Arizona has unique advantages too. I mean, this is a beautiful state. This is one of the great places on earth in which to live. I mean, it truly is. That's why my wife and I moved here 23 years ago. We must use that as a selling feature. We must safeguard the natural resources and the natural splendor and beauty that truly is present throughout our state. We should use that as a tool to bring in investment. And I'll just mention as a postscript, but it is important, and it's a subtext to what I say, in part because others, frankly, don't have the guts to say this, but it's the truth. We have to deal with our border situation because it is not conducive to economic investment in this state to have a bleeding border that is full of chaos, that is full of drug and human trafficking. That's just a fact. And if you've got a choice of where to invest, and that's particularly true for communities along the border. And we're sitting here in Phoenix, but the closer you get to the border, the more of a real issue that is. We need to be honest about these issues. Those are just some of the issues that impact economic growth, but we need to have somebody who will quarterback it, somebody who will be bright and dedicated in trying to bring real investment and real jobs into the state.
Scott, give us a grade and tell us why.
I'd like to say we're doing better, but I'm an outcomes-based person, and the proof is in the results. We lost over 300,000 jobs. We covered just barely half of those, and that's the good news. The worst news is that those jobs are basically minimum wage jobs. And I don't think anyone in this state can or should be happy. We've had some real successes. In my city, we had some successes. In your cities, you've had success. Good stories, but we've also had some disappointments. Arizona can do so much more, but we have to be realistic about what our challenges are. 6 years as mayor, I talked, like many of you have done, I talked to a lot of people who are looking to invest in Arizona, to move companies to Arizona. I talked to one of the biggest, sat down and negotiated with companies like Apple. And I can tell you that I never heard them say, well, we're really not deciding on Arizona because the tax is so high or because your regulatory environment is so out of whack. Now, that's not to say we're perfect. We always can do better, but we're very competitive, basically, with our tax and regulatory policy. I will tell you that every single one of them stressed a basic concern. Can we get enough qualified people to meet our needs? Can we succeed? Can we not only get those locally, or can we bring those in from other states? And that gets back to our education system, and whether the reality or the perception, that our education system is failing. It also gets back to our higher education system, because you look at states that are our peer states, like I don't look at a Texas, but I look at a Utah, a Colorado. They have invested heavily in their higher education. They've made major changes in higher education to create higher education and K-12 that go together and make people believe that they can succeed by investing there. And that's why you cannot separate economic opportunity from educational opportunity until we actually live up and understand that we have got to move from the bottom third in K-12 up to the top third, and we have got to give the impression that our great universities are literally internationally renowned universities. We won't have the kind of investment we need to merit an A grade. That's what it's going to take. That's what it'll take to have the flyovers through California and other that will be stopping here as opposed to going to the other states.
All right, Scott, you got a grade for us? Frank, you got a grade for us? Did you give me a grade, by the way?
I did. I said it was probably a C to B minus.
All right, thank you.
I think that's frankly being generous. I think it's a failing grade. We're still in a very tepid economic recovery, and I think Scott made a good point that many of the jobs that we've added back are not what you would consider to be living wage jobs. So that's why I'm going to focus on jobs in the economy like a laser. That's why I'm going to be a very active, hands-on chairman of the Arizona Commerce Authority. You know, 95% of Arizona businesses are small or very small businesses. I'm a small business owner myself with my wife, have been for decades. I've signed both sides of a paycheck. I've met payroll with my heart in my throat. So I know the risk and the struggles that all, and challenges are challenges that all small business owners face. And in that vein, I understand, I think, what employers, job creators want. They want a low cost, in fact, the lowest cost possible tax and regulatory structure. They want a state that's going to invest in education because more than anything else, they want an educated workforce. A workforce that frankly has those workplace literacy skills, that aptitude, that motivation to be a good employee. And they want a state, as we were discussing earlier, that will invest in infrastructure. So that's where I think the focus has to be. And I'm concerned, we've been in a race to the bottom in terms of how we fund K-12 education. We were talking earlier about diversion of funds. We also pledged lottery revenues, which is a dedicated funding source for K-12 education. And I want to say one other thing about the border, okay? Because there is a perception problem beyond Arizona, that somehow we as Arizonans are intolerant people. I don't think that's the case at all. I think we can secure the border and also show tolerance and inclusiveness. We have a model. When I served in Congress, I helped get the funding to build a double fence on California's border with Mexico. It extends into the Yuma sector of our border, which is secure. It's possible for a Mexican national to undergo a rigorous background check and get a guest worker pass, what is called a Sentry Pass today, which is critically important to the agribusiness economy of Yuma. So we've got the model there. It can be done, but we have to be careful in our language and our rhetoric. We don't want to send the wrong message to the rest of the country, and we also have to preserve that relationship with Mexico. It's a huge part of our culture, our commerce, our history, our heritage as a state, and they are, by the way, continue to be our #1 international trade partner, so that bilateral relationship is very important.
All right, thank you. We've had everything from C to failing grades. What say you?
Okay, the question was, would you give it an A+?
Well, the question was, would you give it an A+? Yes, but I kind
Yeah.
of went past that one. I didn't think of it.
No, I wouldn't give it an A+, but I have met incredible people who are working hard to develop the economy in their local areas, both at the state level, at regional levels, and in the cities. So as to the effort, I would give some of those groups an A. In terms of the results, we've not seen some of the results that we want, and I think critically it's time for us to have a governor in this state who focuses specifically on this issue. And you might know Governor Fannin did this back in the 60s. In fact, he went on a road show with Carl Hayden and Barry Goldwater, and they actually went and they built up these industry concentrations in aerospace and semiconductor and some of the sciences. That's why Arizona is a leader among these issues today. But those relationships have to be nurtured, and that's one of the things that I think we have to focus on as a state. One of the reasons you might want to hire a technology governor. But I do think we have an opportunity also to lay the groundwork for the thousands and thousands of small businesses and entrepreneurs around the state who I've talked to help them be able to create jobs. Because when I've talked to these guys, I've said, what would it take for you to create one job? Just hire one human being. You know what they say? exactly the same thing I would have said when we were a tiny little startup company at GoDaddy. Just get out of our way. Get out of my way. Stop making me file $0 tax returns in cities where I have no revenue. Stop making me file the same permit in every single quarter when nothing in my business has changed. Stop making me wait weeks and months to start a project. Get out of my way. Let me do the business of my business. That is a place where in economic development, this state and our local counties and cities can do a much better job, and our grade will go from a for effort to an A for success.
All right, Fred, what do you got?
All right, I'll start with a D, and I'll tell you why. I believe that the tools have improved. I think ACA is the right tool at the right time. I think that it has a collection of tools, the innovation funds and some of the strategic components that it is utilizing are the right tools at the right time for a 21st century state. That said, a number of Fs. To walk away from Science Foundation Arizona was an F. It was a mistake. It was an error. Send a message to the rest of the country that we're not serious about the 21st century. To walk away from funding TGen last year was a mistake. It's an F. And the statistics that we all now know, Arizona is one of only a handful of states that has not regained its economic strength from before the recession. As others have mentioned, we have lost jobs, and the jobs that we've grown pay less than the jobs that we lost. We've traded middle-class jobs for minimum wage jobs. That's not a sustainable strategy for the 21st century, and there are many components. Yes tax policy, where we have aggressively for 2 decades lowered taxes to become more competitive, and by any yardstick, we are competitive on the tax side. We have a moratorium, which I support that we should continue. No new regulations in order to assure predictable regulatory climate. So those are competitive. But in the absence of talent, in the absence of workforce, in the absence of communicating to the rest of the country that we are an inclusive state that is going to assure that we are going to produce the educated workforce for the business growth of the future, the rest won't work. It is the single most important thing we must do. We have cut education deeper than on a per student basis than any state in the country. Today, our class sizes are the largest in the United States. We lose 1/3 of our teachers every year, and we're communicating as a brand matter to the rest of the country that we're not serious about the workforce requirements that they have. And until we get that right, we won't get the kind of grade that we all aspire to for ourselves or for our children. We've got to quit cutting and start investing in education, not just for the social good in and of itself, but as part of an economic development strategy that reaches towards an A.
Ken, give us a grade.
Statewide, I would say we're at C-. In rural Arizona, I think we're below that, probably a D. And that's got to change. I think economic development comes down to a combination of 4 things. One is cost, the cost of doing business in Arizona. We are fairly competitive, but I think there are things that we can do to make Arizona more competitive by restructuring our tax system. I actually believe we do need to eliminate the state income tax, be the 10th state to eliminate the state income tax and replace it with a low-rate consumption tax that replaces the revenue and makes sure that we don't shift the tax burden by which transactions are collected. We don't have time to get into the details of that right now. But second is talent. That's our education system. I was just fact-checked by the Arizona Republic, because on the campaign trail, I have made the statement that during the 4 years we were Senate President, we put more new money into the K-12 school system in Arizona than any other 4-year period in the history of the state. It was found to be accurate. In fact, I was identifying $640 million that we did during one legislative session. The actual total of new money that we put into K-12 education during the 4 years I was Senate President was $1.2 billion. We also approved the $440 million of funding infrastructure research projects at the universities at a time when the economy was not healthy. So if anyone wants to say, well, Ken, you must have done all that during the good times. I can remember in 2003, brand new Senate President, and Jerry Colangelo comes walking into my door with a few other folks and says, we think we ought to invest $440 million in the universities for infrastructure research projects. And the budgets were in terrible shape, but Jake Flake and I listened to him, and darn it, we ended up agreeing, and we went to our caucuses and said, we think we should do that. And we took a lot of slings and arrows, but we got the Republicans and the Democrats to support that. We did that, and I just went to a seminar about 3-4 weeks ago that the bioscience industry of Arizona sponsored, and it had a little brochure with about 7 or 8 pages, front to and back, of all the startup and growing companies in bioscience that exist in Arizona. And the speaker said that brochure would only be about a page and a half long had we not invested that $440 million in 2003 during some tough budget times. So we've been there, and the third one is regulations. We've all kind of talked about eliminating regulations wherever possible. And fourth is the image of our state. We need a governor who will be out selling the state of Arizona and talking to CEOs and boards of directors to bring those companies here.
Let's do some quick follow-ups on things that you've said here throughout the evenings. Ken, we'll start with you. Eliminating the income tax. Where does that money come from? Where does the revenue come from?
You would replace it with a low-rate, broad-based consumption tax. The income and current state sales tax, which is 5.6%, brings in about $9 billion. If you had a low-rate consumption-type tax on as many transactions in the economy as possible, the economy of Arizona is about $280 billion. If you had a tax on every transaction in the economy, that tax would only have to be 3.5%, and you would collect the same $9 billion. Now, I think there are some transactions in our economy that we shouldn't be taxing. Food and maybe medicine and education and some things. You could exclude $100 billion of the $280 billion, and on the other $180 billion, if you had a 5% consumption type tax, you would collect the same $9 billion. One of the things that this will do, and this is very important to local cities and towns, it will equate the revenue coming into the state's general fund with the economy. Instead of what we have now in our tax system is the revenue spikes very high in the good years and then collapses in the bad years. When I left the state Senate, we were collecting $9.5 and spending $9.5 billion. In 08, 9, and 10, the economy of Arizona, if you look at the GDP numbers, shrunk by about 10%. But the revenue coming into the state's general fund dropped by 1/3, from $9.5 billion to $6.5 billion. If we had a revenue system that flowed with the economy, the revenue would have gone from about $9.5 billion to $8.5 billion. We had $1.1 billion in the state's rainy day fund. We would have managed through that, and as the economy recovered, we would be back above the levels that we were currently at that are going to produce those deficits that Frank was talking about.
Very quickly, critics call it a regressive system.
No, you take the regressiveness out of it by not taxing transactions at the lower economic, or you can do a rebate or a prebate. There's ways to take the regressiveness out of a consumption tax by not taxing transactions at the lower levels of the economic scale.
Fred, you concentrated on education. There are some who say Common Core, or whatever they're calling it this week, is federal intervention. It's Big Brother. It's not the kind of thing that Arizonans want. Local control works best. Get Common Core out of here and let us teach our kids. Valid?
I was there when the first conversations about a national set of academic goals and standards was first brought to the table by a group called Achieve. It was made up of state school officials across the United States. There weren't a bunch of federal bureaucrats doing this. This was a bunch of state leaders who were recognizing that the inherent nature of the economy has changed. Our children aren't competing with children across the street or across the state, but rather across the world. And that we need to have benchmarks so that we can assure ourselves in the way we compare schools and in the way parents make decisions, and so that businesses can make comparisons as to whether or not states are achieving the kind of workforce that they need for the future. And the only way you can do that is to have some benchmark standards. And the fact that they are national, I think, is a part of what's appealing about them. I favor them. I believe Arizona needs to do everything it can to signal to the rest of the world that we're serious about the 21st century economy, that we're serious about talent, we're serious about both making the investment and holding schools, teachers, parents accountable for better results. Secondly, let's touch on something Ken said, and I greatly respect the fact that while Ken and I disagree on the repeal of the income tax, I appreciate the fact that Ken has made a proposal to substitute for it. The notion that we would repeal the Arizona income tax with no replacement simply wipes out our ability to do many of the things that we've talked about today, as well as to invest in education. I do believe it's regressive. Currently today, because of our relative over-reliance on the sales tax relative to other forms of income, for every $100 of a lower income family in Arizona, they pay 4 times as much in taxes as a higher income Arizonan. I think we are over-reliant on the sales taxes relative to a balanced system, and as a result, don't agree with that as the method to pay for education.
Christine, you'd mentioned earlier that we should be running government like a business. A business is there to make profit. Is government there to make profit, or is government there to serve?
Well, clearly government is there to serve, and I think it's important for us to return to the notion that we call it public service because it's about serving the public and not the other way around. Now, is government there to make a profit? No, not per se. Nevertheless, it's important if you bifurcate policy making from budget running, and you have to because we all know that policy making is different than money, you should run your budget with the bottom line, and you should have it in mind. And you should have a set of metrics against which your performance is measured, and then you should measure it. Now, having spent 10 years working with the United States Congress to develop policy, I can assure you that the policy development piece works much differently than that. We all know that that's about coalition building and bringing people together to find things about which they can agree, and that's very different than running a business. Nevertheless, if we don't start running it on a budget basis with a mind to the bottom line, we will never get out of that $1 billion of deficit that's projected for 2016, because we all had a similar meeting with Andy Biggs, the president of the Senate, on this budget issue. It's critical to be honest about it. And to both Secretary Bennett and Mr. Duval's point, if you don't have a plan to replace taxes that you're going to eliminate, or you don't have a mind to levelize and not disproportionately disadvantage low-income families, all of the things that you just throw out as campaign spin and campaign rhetoric, you ought not to throw those ideas out there, because frankly, you don't do that in business. If you have a set of expenses that you have to cover, you have to be honest with yourself and say, how much of my product do I have to sell to cover that? And that's what we have to do.
Frank, you had mentioned the illegal immigration situation and the image of the state. I wanted to follow up on that. How do you control the border, secure the border, whatever that means, and keep the image of Arizona as an open and welcoming place?
It can actually be done. It takes true leadership, courageous leadership. And I think my service in the Army and my service as a police officer and my service, frankly, in Congress, the 3 oaths that I've taken in my life, gave me the strength of character and taught me moral and, yes, physical courage. So I think I can provide that leadership. I do want to correct one thing, and that is the forecast, Ms. Jones mentions, we all got it, the forecast, the actual projected deficit for the year-end, current fiscal year-end is $444 million, and the projected deficit for FY15, not 16, 15, is $924 million. So just want to make sure we're working off of real numbers. But back to Ted's question, I mentioned for a moment that I've been working hard to control immigration and to combat illegal immigration and amnesty, going all the way back, frankly, to when I was a police officer, working the streets, but certainly when I served in Congress. And I said what's occurred on the Yuma sector of the border is the model for what we need to do on the Tucson sector of the border. I don't think it is unrealistic for a border state governor, as I intend to do, to coordinate between our federal government, state government, Mexican national government, the 2 regional governments in Mexico abutting our border, and say to the Mexican authorities, my counterparts, if you will, in Mexico, very loudly, very clearly, look, we want and need that relationship with you, but you must do your part to secure your side of the 2,000-mile international border that we share. You must prove to us that you will be a reliable national security partner. And that's so important for protecting, again, that bilateral trading relationship, our #1 international trade partner, and for protecting, again, that special heritage and history and culture and commerce that we derive as a state from our relationship with Mexico. It can be done, and I want to add one other point, and that is, it's not like we're heartless or discompassionate. Last year, we sent those 3 Central American countries $400 million in federal humanitarian aid, federal taxpayer assistance to those 3 countries. We gave the government of Mexico $300 million earmarked for drug interdiction and for the training, technology, and equipment of Mexican law enforcement entities at the federal and state level. That's $700 million, ladies and gentlemen, that would have been far better spent building the appropriate barrier on the Tucson sector of our border. I'm a former United States congressman. I'll have credibility and respect with the Arizona congressional delegation. I know the leadership of Congress. I will get this done.
Scott, you mentioned earlier that you would call for a ban on unfunded mandates. That leads to the leadership question and the ability to get things done in a legislature that may not agree with what you want to do. How do you handle a situation like that?
That's an interesting question. That's called governing. It's called leadership. It's called democracy. Throughout my life, the successes that I've had has been because I've been able to bring people together. That's what leaders do. Leaders help create a vision. Then they bring people together to devise a plan and then to work a plan. When I took over as mayor of Mesa, government is very different than business. I ran a business for many years. The last 12 years was CEO of a very small then large home building business. And when I walked into the mayorship, I said, I'm going to do this like a business. And I found out very quickly, dealing with those who work in the city, it's a different animal. But there are certain principles that are the same. Regardless of who you're working with, it's about people and it's about stating that vision. And it's about bringing, and then it's about bringing people together. And I think that's what we really need. We need to build upon what we talk about knocking the legislature, but the legislature and Governor Brewer have gotten us through a very, very difficult time. And they've and the governor has led us to set a foundation that whoever takes over can build upon. That means we're going to have to talk about where Arizona is headed, where Arizona is going to be, where your children and grandchildren are going to be. We tend to get bogged down in specifics and in procedure here as opposed to talking about where we want to go. And that's what a leader does. That's how I'll bring people together. For a mayor of a Mesa, Arizona, although we're the 38th largest city in the country, I like to say when I go back to U.S. Conference mayors, we're the biggest city you've never heard of, and most of the mayors would say, yeah, you're right, I've never heard of you. It's funny that I was able to bring people to talk about things like border security. Yeah, that was right. In the SB 1070 era, to get these other mayors to come together. The U.S. Conference is 2/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican. And yet we brought together and I was able to have them elect me as their president. And we didn't do that by fighting all the time. We did that by finding areas of consensus. I like to say that Kevin Johnson, who took over for me, he's an Obama Democrat. I'm a Reagan Republican. And yet we, every day, could find 4 and 5 things that we agreed upon, whether it be transportation, education, things that were important, so we came together. And that's how I'll govern as governor, finding the common ground that takes us forward, understanding that we're going to have different opinions about how specifically to get there. And yes, unfunded mandates would be one of them. But if we're focused on where we want to go, if we're focused on where we want to end up, we generally will find a way to get there. And a way to get there that's fair, that's reasonable, and that takes into account what everyone has to offer. And that's the main thing about cities and towns, is recognizing that our economic engines and where things happen, not only here across the country, but here in Arizona, happens in cities and towns. The state and the cities and towns must partner.
Okay.
We cannot be adversarial.
Scott, thank you. Andrew, you refer to this yourself, that you bring up immigration at almost every question. So when voters look at you, why do they not think that you are going to spend your entire time on the 9th floor thinking and working on immigration as opposed to other pressing issues?
Well, 2 things. First of all, when I was county attorney, I had a record on a range of issues, and people can read more about them at voteandrewthomas.com. But we tackled things from pollution that had been in the Tres Rios riparian area that hadn't been cleaned up. We drove down the crime rate. I ended plea bargaining as we know it in fulfillment of a campaign promise. For serious violent criminals, we increased the incarceration rate 29%, and crime went down throughout the valley and indeed throughout the state, because the valley crime rates drive the state crime rate. So these are other areas. There are a whole range of issues that I have successfully addressed in the past. But I keep talking about illegal immigration, and I will continue to, because number one, it is politically incorrect to talk about it, and our failure to talk about it, not for years, but for decades, is what has put us behind the 8 ball. And second, if we don't deal with this issue very soon as a state, if we do not deal with it successfully, it will be too late. Other states have been overwhelmed by illegal immigration. They are not able to pay their bills. They don't seem to care very much. They will eventually. I don't want to see that happen to Arizona. And so this is something I am passionate about. It is at the heart of why I entered politics. When I ran for Maricopa County Attorney 10 years ago, I had the slogan, "Stop Illegal Immigration," on my signs. I saw it was an important issue. It has now become more acceptable to at least talk about the issue. But since I left office, all those efforts have unraveled. All of our success has been washed away, and we need somebody who's going to be very tough and very focused in dealing with this issue that will not go away.
All right. I believe it is now time for our 1-minute closing remarks, and we will go in reverse order of our opening statements, which means, Andrew Thomas, you're first.
Well, you get another dose of me. Well, I want to thank you all again for hosting this apparently final debate before the primary election. And again, thank you for your service to your communities. Arizona faces an important choice. That's true in every election, but to conclude the comments that I began before, if we do not address the heart of the matter in this state and get somebody who is willing to, these other issues are important, but they are dwarfed in importance. They are dwarfed in relevant importance given the serious situation we have on the border. Jobs, education, health care, those are important issues. I have positions on those. I urge you, if you're curious, go to voteandrewthomas.com and read about them. But I want to conclude here, as I began this campaign and indeed my political career, this issue is a very tough issue to solve. Taking on illegal immigration is not just having a press conference or running a bill at the legislature. It is literally about taking on the entire political, legal, and media establishment for years, and all the attacks that come from that to have success. And I succeeded where others failed. We stopped illegal immigration before. As governor, I'll do it again. And if we do that, things will get better, and Arizona will continue to be one of the great places on earth in which to live. Thank you, and God bless you.
And thank you very much. Scott Smith now with closing remarks.
Thank you, and once again, thank you so much for hosting us. And to me, of all the debates and the forums we've been to, this is the most important. And I think it's a shame that one of our opponents declined to come here and sit before the leaders of this state. I think it's an absolute shame that happened. And the reason being is that as we go forward in our future, we're going to have to work together. This is going to be a joint project between the cities, the towns, the counties, and this state. And the leader of this state should understand that he or she needs the cities and towns. We need to work together. I learned that as a mayor. I learned that more than I ever believed I would. And it absolutely disappointed me when there was not friction, which is going to happen, but when there was almost a war between cities and towns and the state. And luckily, we had Governor Brewer who believed in that and stood up for us in many crucial areas. If we don't have that going forward, if we don't work together, we will not create the kind of future that we need. And I want you to remember one thing. I believe in this state. I believe that our best days are ahead of us, regardless of all the challenges we talked about. Our best days are ahead of us. And we need somebody, and the reason I'm running, although we're all qualified in our own ways, there's only one person who has had the experience of leading a business and through the worst recession ever of leading a city and knowing what it's like to have to make things happen. Thank you so very much for having us. Thank you for all that you do. And I would love to have your support, and I would love to work together. This is not about me. This is about we to build a better Arizona. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank Riggs.
Well, thank you, Ted. And ladies and gentlemen, there's only one candidate in this race who served in the United States Congress, the highest legislative body in our country, served with distinction as a reformer and a leader of that institution. And after having been in politics for the last 16 years, joking all the while that I was a recovering politician, I'm back in the arena because our state needs a proven, courageous leadership at the helm. The challenges are that great, and I mentioned just one this evening, the projected almost $1 billion budget deficit come next July. Only one candidate is a military veteran. Only one candidate has served as a police officer. So I can walk my talk when I say that I'll make public safety, which is the first responsibility of state government, top priority, including securing the border. I have the deepest background in education, and I walk my talk when I say that I'll be an education governor who makes sure that every Arizona child has access to a high-quality education, because that's where equal opportunity in our state and our society begins. I'll promise you this, perhaps unlike the incumbent, I'll be a visible and accessible governor at every part of Arizona. I won't hide out. I believe in going before the people. I believe in being a servant leader like you do, representing and serving our constituents and holding myself accountable to them. So I'm Frank Riggs. I hope you'll look at my website. I'd be honored to have your support and your vote. And if you give me that trust, I promise you, I'll be a governor you can be proud of.
Thank you very much. Christine Jones.
Yeah, thanks again, Ted, for doing this, and to the League for hosting us. It's been a privilege to meet so many of you around the state. Thank you again for your kindness and your hospitality as we visited your communities. This has been an interesting journey for somebody who's never run for office before. And, you know, we've done a lot of these debates. I don't know how many the other guys have done. This is my 54th or something like that. And we've got lots of stories to tell. And I've developed a friendship and a respect for all of the gentlemen involved here. And I think they all love Arizona too, in their own way and for their own reason. But it strikes me that, particularly in the Republican primary, no aspersions to Mr. Duval, against who I'm not running yet, that with 50 years of collective experience, if we had such great ideas for border security and economic development and excellence in education, why just bring them out now? If you're such a great leader, why are we just hearing about these great plans now? So it strikes me there's a vacuum, and it needs to be filled by a fearless, determined, proven leader. That's why I'm running for governor. That's why I came out of my private life and painted this target on my back so that people could attack me. And by the way, they did attack me. But I'm Christine Jones. I would love your support. Thanks so much for being here, and thank you for what you do every single day to make Arizona such an incredible place. Thanks.
Thank you. Fred Duval.
Thank you. And thank all of you. I look forward to working with you as your next governor, and I know that we are in a shared enterprise to make Arizona the greatest state we can make it. But we need to focus very strategically on what are the strategic goals that are most important at this time in our state's history. Let me list what they are to me. Number one, no more cuts to education. We must make sure that every child has the teacher, the classroom, the opportunity to manifest their God-given gifts. Number two, inclusion. Talent comes in every human form and package, and we've got to create an environment where everyone, no more 1062s, where everyone feels welcome to contribute and be entrepreneurial and be a part of the future. Third, innovation. We've got to create and invent the new products and manufacture and export the new products of the future that the rest of the world will buy. Fourth, location. Sitting on top of Mexico is an enormously important commercial trade opportunity for us. We need to embrace it, much as the mayors of Tucson and Phoenix and others have, with everything we have, because it is an opportunity. But last and most importantly is collaboration. And it's what that has marked my life's work. I worked with Governor Babbitt, with Majority Leader Burton Barr, at a time when we started access. We built the Phoenix Freeway system. We built the state land department. We took teacher salaries to a statewide salary increase. We did big, important strategic things on a bipartisan basis. When President-elect Clinton called me, he said, I'd like you to come to the White House because your ability to work with Republicans and Democrats is required. We've just passed welfare reform and need someone to oversee its implementation in all 50 states. And similarly, when Boone Pickens decided he wanted to lead an energy revolution for American energy independence, he said, we can work together, Republicans and Democrats alike. That's what the kind of collaboration we need to have around strategic goals for the state of Arizona, and I hope to lead us there.
All right, very good. Thank you, Fred. Ken.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you for what you do in your communities. As I started with, the one thing I'd like you to remember about Ken Bennett is experience matters. I mentioned 30 years in the private sector. I mentioned local government experience. I and Scott have sat in the chairs that you sit in every week. But also legislative leadership experience. I served in the state Senate and as president, and during that time we brought people together. The last time the state budget was balanced, without accounting tricks and gimmicks, sweeps from you, and temporary tax increases, was when we were in the Senate and we brought people together. We had a narrow majority of Republicans in the Senate, but we passed those budgets with majorities of the Republican caucus and the Democrat caucus. We passed budgets with 24, 25, 26 votes, not just 16. I'll close with one other thing, and that is, in this political process, there's a lot of talk about endorsements. And most of the time we get endorsements from fellow politicians, and I have some of those and picked up one today. And I'm proud to have those, but the endorsements I'm proudest to have are 4 statewide law enforcement associations: the correctional officers that work in the state prison system, the Fraternal Order of Police, the Arizona Highway Patrolmen's Association, and the Conference of Police and Sheriffs, which represent about 25,000 between those four groups of law enforcement men and women around the state. And I think they are endorsing me because they can remember during my city council days and my Senate president days that I kept my word, took care of them because they take care of us. I will take care of Arizona. I look forward and would be honored to serve you as the next governor. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, candidates. Thank you, audience. Thanks as well to the audience watching the streaming web video here. I want to thank the City of Phoenix and thank the Sheraton as well for what we hope was a very informative debate. In case you had forgotten, primary date is 1 week away. So we encourage your vote and we encourage your informed vote. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, sir.